This is a GCSE biology presentation on breathing. To get started, there are two questions. The first is, what is respiration? And the second one is to write the equation to show respiration. And you can do a word or chemical equation, whichever you prefer, or even both. Pause the presentation now, and when you're ready, you can restart and check through your answers. The first question, what is respiration? Well, hopefully you will not have gone down the classic mistake of saying that respiration is breathing. We can talk about respiring as breathing, but respiration is a chemical process in which oxygen and glucose are converted into carbon dioxide and water. As a result of this chemical reaction, we have energy released. In terms of formula, we can write it using a word equation, where we have glucose, oxygen, and then the single line arrow, water and carbon dioxide, or we can use the chemical formula and we can do a balanced chemical formula equation. I've also thrown in some pictures just to help you try and get it to stick in your head. The lesson objectives, well, we're going to look at the structure of the breathing system. We're going to look at the process of inhalation and exhalation, and then we're going to look a bit more detail at the lungs and particularly the alveoli and how they are adapted for gas exchange. Folks, people get respiration and respiring confused all the time, so I just want to make it very, very clear. Respiration is not breathing. Respiration is the chemical process that we just mentioned. Breathing is the mechanism by which gas is moved into and out of the lungs. And then we have gas exchange, which is what occurs in the alveoli of the lungs, and that is where gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. In our first task, we are looking at the structure of the breathing system. Now, at this point, you have a choice. You can, if you think you already know it, by all means, go ahead and label the diagram. If, however, you're looking at the diagram and you just don't have a clue where to even start, what I suggest you do is go through the presentation, memorize the diagram, and then when you think you've memorized it, go back through the presentation and test yourself. The most important thing is you've got to be able to name all the parts. When you're ready, you can pause the presentation now and restart to see your answers. In terms of the names of the different parts, we start at the top with the trachea. Please don't confuse the trachea with the esophagus. The trachea is connected to the lungs and it's where gas moves in and out of, whereas the esophagus is connected to the stomach and it's one that food and liquid goes down. The small white circles represent the ribs. Between the ribs, we have what are called intercostal muscles. We also have the trachea break up into two separate tubes. Those two separate tubes are referred to as bronchi, or we can refer to each one on its own as a bronchus. The tubes then get smaller and smaller and smaller as we move further into the lungs, and you end up with what are called bronchioles. At the end of the bronchioles, we have small cauliflower-shaped objects called alveoli, and each of the alveoli are surrounded by a capillary network. At the very bottom of the entire thing, we have what's called a diaphragm. Now, we can refer to that whole diagram as a thorax. So when we talk about a thorax, we are actually talking about everything inside the ribs, the intercostal muscles, and everything inside the lungs. In terms of GCSE questions, the only ones that really you need to know off by heart are the trachea, the bronchi, the alveoli, and the fact that the alveoli is surrounded by a capillary network. Everything else I suggest you do learn, particularly if you're looking to do A-level biology, and it's certainly going to help with your understanding later on. So once you've been able to do the structure of the breathing system from memory, the next thing is to learn is the function of each part. So on the left hand side you have 5 functions, on the right hand side you have the name of 5 parts. You have to be able to memorize them, and you can pause the presentation now and do your best attempt, and when you're ready, restart and check your answers, or again go through it once, find out the answers, memorize them, and then go back and try it again. The most important thing is, if you're going to memorize them, you have to link the word to the definition, you cannot just learn the order in which the lines go, because in the exam they can take the words away completely and expect you to know them, or they can give you things in different orders. So don't just learn, oh, the top one goes to the bottom one, etc., etc. You have to be able to correctly learn the definitions to each of the words. So pause the presentation now, and when you're ready, you can restart and check out your answers. Well, our first definition, we talk about lobe structures, we're talking about the lungs. When we talk about rings of cartilage, we are talking about the trachea. Tubes of cartilage which produce mucus, we're talking about the bronchi, which is what the trachea breaks up into bronchi, which are the first two tubes. We then have a series of tubes, again all smaller, which are the bronchioles, and we have the alveoli, which is the smaller air sacs. Before we start looking in detail about the gas exchange that occurs between the alveoli and the blood capillaries, it's worth spending a moment just to have a basic understanding of how gas actually moves into and out of the alveoli through the entire system. We talk about inhalation, breathing in, and exhalation, breathing out. In the diagram in front of you, you have the letters A to G, and each of those statements, A to G, fits into the flow diagram. You've got two types of muscles. Remember, the intercostal muscles are the muscles between the ribs. The diaphragm is the big muscle along the bottom. At this point, pause the presentation and try and put A to G into the correct order to describe what happens when we breathe in. To help you, you can actually cheat in the exam in this way as well. Put your hands on your rib cage and then take a huge big breath in and see if you can work out what's going on. Pause the presentation now. When you're ready, you can restart the presentation and check your answers. So when we're breathing in, we have what's the intercostal muscles, and to start with, the intercostal muscles contract. When we're breathing in, we are contracting muscles. When we contract muscles, what happens is our rib cage moves up and out. If you put your hands on your rib cage and take a big, huge, deep breath in, you should find your rib cage is moving up and out and expanding. In terms of the diaphragm, again, you have another diaphragm muscle and it contracts. And when it contracts, it gets really, really flat. Instead of a big dome, it lays down as flat as it can. All of that combined means that the volume of the thorax, and the thorax is simply all the area contained around the lungs. So you have a membrane around the outside of the lungs, keeping everything like a giant balloon. Everything inside that is referred to as the thorax. Again, folks, don't worry, you do not have to remember these terms. I'm just giving you a basic understanding of how gas moves in and out. Because the volume is increased, what has happened is the pressure inside there has decreased, which means the air actually moves in from the outside environment. Because of the constant inhaling and exhaling of air, what we have is a high concentration of certain gases inside the alveoli and a low concentration of other gases inside the alveoli. Remember, air is actually a mixture of gases, including carbon dioxide and oxygen, and those are the two main gases we need to talk about. When we breathe in, we breathe air. We take all of the gases inside the air into our lungs. It's only the carbon dioxide and the oxygen that move into or out of the blood vessels. So you've got to be careful in the exam when you're talking about breathing. We talk about the movement of air. When we talk about gas exchange, we are talking about carbon dioxide and oxygen moving into or out of the alveoli and into and out of the blood. Inside the alveoli, you have very high concentrations of O2. Inside the blood, you have very low concentrations of O2 because the O2 has been used in respiration. And we'll come back to that later on in another presentation. That means that from a high concentration to a low concentration, the gas O2 moves by diffusion. and it moves into the red blood cells. And that's an important thing to remember. When you are given a diagram in the exam, if it says draw an arrow to show the movement of oxygen, you have to show that it goes from the alveoli into a red blood cell. It's not enough to show it going into the blood capillary. It has to be literally the arrow going into the red blood cell. In terms of carbon dioxide is a gas that is produced by cells in our body by a process called respiration. When they do respiration, they release the CO2 into the blood, and the CO2 ends up at the blood capillary next to an alveoli. The blood capillaries contain blood plasma, which has a much higher CO2 concentration, and so it moves by diffusion from the blood capillaries into the alveoli. And this is the important bit about the breathing system. This is the gas exchange. We've got oxygen moving from a high concentration in the alveoli to a lower concentration in the red blood cells, and we have the carbon dioxide moving from a higher concentration in the blood plasma into the alveoli, which has a lower concentration. And both gases move by a process of diffusion. When we talk about how quickly diffusion is occurring, we talk about the rate of diffusion. And the rate of diffusion from one part of a body to another part of a body is dependent on three different variables. And changing any one of these three variables will increase or decrease the rate of diffusion depending on what you do. So we talk about the surface area, the actual bit of gas exchanging, the surface that can move across. We can talk about the concentration difference, which is the difference in the concentration of the substance on one side of the membrane compared to the other side of a membrane. And we also have to talk about the distance that the substance has to move, so how thick the membrane is. If the membrane is really thick, it's obviously very hard for the substance to move across, so the rate of diffusion will be low. If the membrane is really thin, then the substance can get across very quickly and the rate of diffusion will be higher. If we increase the surface area, if there's more surface area, there's more room for the substance to move across, so that will also increase the rate of diffusion. And if we make a bigger difference in concentration, we will make the rate of diffusion increase. Now, alveoli have some very special adaptations, and the special adaptations are all based around making the surface area as big as possible, making the concentration difference as big as possible, and making the distance that the gases have to travel across, remember CO2 and O2, as small as possible. Because by increasing the surface area, increasing the concentration difference, or decreasing the difference, we will make the rate of diffusion increase. So the gases move in and out of the blood faster. How this actually occurs is the alveoli have a very peculiar shape, looks like a little cauliflower shape, and that is because it will increase the surface area. We also have very thin walls, and they have walls that are essentially one cell thick. And because the cells are one cell thick, the gases have a very short distance to travel to get from one place to another. The red blood cells inside the capillaries are pushed tight up against the blood capillaries. Again, that also helps reduce the distance because capillaries are only one cell thick. So we've got the smallest distance possible for the gases to have to travel across during diffusion. And of course, most important, which we mentioned at the start when we looked at the structure of the lungs, we talk about the fact that it has an excellent blood supply. There is a large capillary network around the alveoli, as you can see in the picture in the bottom right, and that large capillary network is constantly moving substances along, so we keep a high concentration gradient. The difference between the concentration of the gases on one side of the alveoli and the other side of the alveoli is as big as possible. And by keeping that concentration difference as big as possible, we maximize the rate of diffusion. So to finish off, I want you to contrast respiration and respiring. Now, if you're looking at those words thinking they're the same thing, the problem is that respiring can actually mean breathing, and respiring can actually mean carrying out respiration inside a cell. So it's always much better to avoid the word respiring and talk about the word respiration, which is the chemical process in which glucose and oxygen are converted into carbon dioxide and water, resulting in a release in energy, and breathing. Have a go, come up with some contrast, remember means differences, and when you're ready you can restart the presentation to see how you did. Pause the presentation now. There are a number of different things that you could have said when contrasting respiration and breathing, and here's a few examples. Respiration is a chemical process, whereas breathing is a mechanical one. In respiration, we result in a release of energy, whereas breathing, energy is actually required for muscle contraction. And of course, respiration occurs inside a cell. Specifically, it occurs inside mitochondria, whereas breathing actually involves a range of organs and tissues working together.